بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم إذا جاء نصر الله والفتح ورأيت الناس يدخلون في دين الله أفواجا فسبح بحمد ربك واستغفره إنه كان توابا.
The Islamic nation, a nation that carried the banner of truth. From the deserts of Arabia, its light spread across the world, guiding hearts, breaking idols, humbling tyrants. Through centuries it faced enemies and oppression, tyrants who sought to extinguish its flame. And at times the light seemed faint, yet always it rose again. From the battle of the trench to the defeat of the Crusaders, from the crushing of the Mongols to the fall of empires that sought its end, the nation endured, and its light never faltered. From among the defenders of this nation rose a group that defied the greatest of tyrants. From British colonizers, the mighty Soviet Red Army, to the American invaders, they turned the mountains and valleys of Khorasan into the graveyard of empires, the Afghan Mujahideen.
تبقى شعارات الصمود سليمة وأنا القتيل تبقى شعارات الصمود تخوننا أين العقول لا تنصح عني بالركون لكل مهزوم هزيم.
In the year 1978, a shadow fell over Afghanistan. The communists of the People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan seized Kabul in what they called the Sour Revolution. President Mohammed Daoud Khan, who had himself once overthrown the monarchy, was gunned down in his palace, along with most of his family. The red flag of atheism was raised. The new regime was ruthless. They forced land reforms that tore apart villages. They targeted imams and scholars, branding them enemies of the state. The Quran was mocked. The people were silenced, and those who resisted were executed without trial. But Afghanistan was not a land that bowed to tyrants. From the mountains of Kunar to the deserts of Kandahar, uprisings erupted. Tribes took up arms. Scholars called for a struggle. The communists had seized power in Kabul, but they could not seize the faith from the hearts of the believers.
الصليب بأرضنا يتبختر الحرب دائرة على الإسلام يا قومي فهل منكم أبي يثأر.
By 1979, the communist regime was collapsing under its own brutality. Infighting split their leaders, villages rose in defiance, and Moscow, fearing the loss of its puppet, made a decision that would change history. December 24th, 1979. The Soviet Red Army invaded Afghanistan. More than 80,000 soldiers crossed the border. Tanks thundered down the valleys. Helicopters filled the skies. The bear had entered the land of the lions. In a single night, Soviet commandos stormed the presidential palace. The communist ruler was executed. And in his place, Moscow installed a new puppet, one who obeyed their orders without question. The Kremlin thought the Afghan people would be subdued. They thought Islam would be silenced. But they were wrong. Afghanistan was not a land that bowed to tyrants. The invaders soon learned that every valley, every village, every mountain was guarded by faith.
فنادى داعي الجهاد أقبل يا مجاهد أقبل يا مجاهد فسل سيف المنون ألوفا يجاهد لا يا شمس النجاهد لا تغربي عنا فنحن الكتائب لا يا شمس
Ordinary men, farmers, shepherds, students of Quran took up rifles and became guardians of the Khorasan. They had little wealth, they had no tanks and no planes, but they had the belief and trust in Allah and the mountains at their backs. They struck convoys in the night. They ambushed armored columns in the valleys. They shot down helicopters with nothing but courage and a rocket launcher on their shoulder. The Soviets called them rebels and terrorists, but the Ummah knew their true name, the Afghan Mujahideen, and soon they were not alone.
الله أقوى وأقدر ممن عدا وتكبر ممن بغى وتجبر.
Soon, the scholars of the Ummah would raise their voices, reminding the Muslims of their duty to stand with their brothers. Among them was Sheikh al-Mujahideen, Abdullah Azzam, a man who called the Ummah to this struggle with his pen, his tongue, and his blood. His words echoed from mosques to universities, awakening a generation to rise and defend the honor of the Muslims.
ولا تجد على ألسنة المسلمين يرددون سوى كيف قام الفعل الفلاني وأمريكا غير راضية، وكيف نجح الفعل الفلاني وروسيا غاضبة، وكأنها أصبحت تعالى الله عما يظنون علوا كبيرا، كأن أمريكا وروسيا أصبحت إلها من دون الله سبحانه. لماذا؟ لأن الله لا يغلب، الله لا يهزم، قوته لا تذل. وهذا الذي غاب عن أذهان القوى الكبرى وعن أذهان الذين يدورون في فلك القوى الكبرى، حتى غابت عن أذهان كثير من المسلمين الطيبين. نعم، الله أراد أن يثبت للأمة المسلمة أني أنا القوي الجبار المتكبر، أن أي شعب مسلم مهما كان ضعيفا أميا فقيرا إذا جاهد ودافع عن دينه فالله ينصره.
From the deserts of Arabia, from the plains of Egypt, from the mountains of Chechnya, and from the lands of Central Asia, the call was answered by Muslims from across the world. Across Afghanistan and Pakistan, Mujahideen camps emerged. From the mountains of Kunar to the valleys of Helmand, from the refugee camps in Peshawar to the hills of Quetta, believers gathered to train, to learn, and to join the fighting. The battle raged across the country. The Soviets had taken control of all major cities, but from the mountains, the Mujahideen struck back, ambushing convoys, destroying armored columns, and raining thousands of casualties upon the Red Army.
وأرض الإباء الباغي عداها حتى دوى مدفع الحق قضاء. وأرض الإباء الباغي عداها حتى دوى مدفع الحق قضاء. حي حشودا للرب سجودا.
Slowly, as the Mujahideen grew stronger with weapons, training, and logistical support from the Ummah, the Soviets realized they could not maintain their grip. Over time, they began to retreat. 2 years later, their collapse became inevitable, and they abandoned their puppet government to the hands of the Mujahideen, defeated and humiliated. On the 15th of February 1989, the last Soviet soldier crossed the Amu Darya River. 9 long years of blood and fire had ended. The bear had limped back to Moscow, humiliated, defeated, and broken. And just 2 years later, the Soviet Union itself would collapse, its empire crumbling under the weight of failure, its defeat in Afghanistan remembered as the first sign of its end.
عندما رأيت الشعب الأفغاني المسلم واقف فوق ذرى الهندوكوش يزلزل الدنيا كلها بصيحة الله أكبر، ورأيت الروس مهزومين أمامه أدركت أني أعز إنسان على الأرض لأني أحمل جنسية هذا الشعب وهي جنسية الإسلام.
With the Soviets gone, the puppet government they had propped up crumbled. Its leaders, stripped of their only support, were swept aside by the Afghan people. But freedom did not bring peace. Afghanistan, though liberated, was a land of chaos and uncertainty. Factions and warlords fought for power, their greed and ambition spreading corruption across the land. Villages became battlegrounds. Alliances formed and shattered. The people, tired of war, wondered who could truly lead them in justice and faith. Yet even in these dark days, pearls of the Ummah emerged. Among them was the Mujahid Sheikh, Jamil Rahman al-Afghani. He fought to establish the Quran and Sunnah upon the way of the earliest generations of the Muslims. He stood against corruption in the religion, against innovations that polluted the faith, calling the people back to pure Tawheed.
بمنارات الهدى هم حاجزا دون الغواية مركز للخير أفضى نور وعي ودراية بمنارات الهدى هم حاجزا دون الغواية.
In January 1991, he proclaimed the Islamic Emirate of Kunar. He appointed ministers of defense, justice, finance, and education, building a state with Islamic law, not tribal strife or worldly ambition. He forbade the worship of saints, the practices of idolatry and disbelief, the false innovations that had crept into the Islamic nation. His emirate shone as a light of purity and reform, a reminder of what Islam truly was. But this light drew the envy of men. Hostile forces gathered surrounding the emirate, seeking to extinguish what he had built. Yet the struggle continued, undaunted, steadfast and firm.
لكن في 8 أيام اشتد وجمعوا الأبطال 5 من الولايات الأخرى فأدخلوها لكن الحمد لله كان يريد الآن الإمارة تحت ولايتكم. أكثر المناطق ولاية في أيدي الإمارة غاية مركز الولاية دخلوها إلى المركز لكن الآن ما تعتبر الإمارة سقطت في أيديهم. لا ما سقطت في أيديهم. الحمد لله الله بالشيخ والخير. الحمد لله نسأل الله أن ينصر الحق أينما كان. آمين جزاك الله خير. أفدت واجد سلوا لنا ونحن نحتاج إلى دعائكم. الله يسدد الخطى الجميع ويهدي الجميع ويصلح ذات بينكم. آمين. يجعلكم عونا على عدو الإسلام والمسلمين. آمين. اللهم صل على محمد. جزاكم الله خيرا.
August 30th, 1991, a traitor disguised as a journalist cowardly drew his weapon and shot the Sheikh. May Allah accept him among the martyrs and raise him in the company of the righteous. Though the emirate was struck down by forces of evil, his call endures. The call of Tawheed, the call of Quran and Sunnah, a light that no enemy can extinguish.
ليس الشهيد بميت بل عند رزاق العبيد. بشرى يا الشهيد بشرى من الله المجيد ليس الشهيد بميت بل عند رزاق العبيد.
From the chaos of war and division, a new force began to take shape. In the southern and eastern regions, a group sought to establish an Islamic emirate across all of Afghanistan, rising amid the ruins of decades of conflict. Step by step, the movement gained control of the countryside, liberating towns and villages until much of Afghanistan came under their authority. Yet opposition remained. A coalition of former Mujahedin had slowly lost their way during years of conflict. Exposed to the influence of power, wealth, and Western ideas, they became secular and detached from Islam. This group, known as the Northern Alliance, resisted the unification of Afghanistan under the banner of Sharia. They fought not for faith, but for their own interests, clinging to the old divisions and the corruption of the past. Western governments, alarmed at the rise of an Islamic Emirate independent of their influence, saw an opportunity. From Washington to London, strategies were drawn, weapons were sent, funds were funneled, intelligence and guidance were shared. The Northern Alliance, hungry for control and eager to reclaim lost power, became the instrument of foreign ambitions. And then the invasion came. With Western air power roaring through the skies and troops at their command, a Western coalition moved into Afghanistan. Airstrikes shattered the mountain's silence. The Northern Alliance fought alongside the invaders, helping and supporting them. Villages were seized, roads were blocked, communication lines were cut. The invaders believed that the people, untested in modern warfare, would quickly yield to superior firepower. But the defenders did not falter. Mujahedin regrouped and took to the mountains once more. The spirit that had crushed the Red Army decades before still lived in the hearts of the Muslims. Every valley became a fortress, every pass a trap, every village a center of resistance. The invaders had the technology, the money, the foreign soldiers, but they could not conquer the faith of a nation. The struggle had entered a new stage. The mountains had seen the rise of tyrants before, and now they would see their downfall again.
إنا مللنا من لسان يزأر يتقاسم الأعداء أوطاني على مرأى الورى وكأننا لا نشعر. أين النظام العالمي ألا ترى شعبا يباد وبالقذائف يهدر. أين العدالة أم شعار يحتوي سفك الدماء وبالإدانة يستر. ما دام أن الشعب شعب مسلم لا حل إلا قولهم نستنكر.
Years of war dragged on. The invaders poured their wealth, their soldiers, and their weapons into Afghanistan, but the mountains remained unconquered, the valleys unbroken, and the faith of the people untouched. For every fortress they built, the Mujahideen struck it down. For every road they cleared, ambushes awaited in the shadows. Their armies grew weary, their coffers drained. Their people back home questioned the cost of fighting a war that could not be won. The puppet government they had installed grew weaker with each passing year. Corruption spread in its halls, its soldiers deserted, its leaders clung to power only through the protection of foreign troops. And then, as with the Soviets before them, the day came when the invaders could no longer endure. Defeated, humiliated, and broken, they packed their weapons, lowered their flags, and in a final offensive, Kabul and the last strongholds of the traitors were liberated, returning the land to the hands of the Muslims. The Mujahedin stormed the presidential palace and declared the defeat of the invaders.
كم تمنينا سنينا أن نكون مجاهدين وعقدنا العزم أن فجرنا فجر مبينا فجرنا فجر مبينا وصرخنا الله أكبر لن نكل ونستكينا عزمنا عزم الأسود ما بقينا وما حيينا ما بقينا وما حيينا